people were saying that Russia wasn't a European country. Like, you know, you had the Western Europeans and their garbage superiority complex were unironically trying to say that Russia is not a European country. As much as a lot of you people don't want to hear it, you don't have Europe without Russia. Like, you can't have Europe without Russia. People try to paint Russia as this like super different, super like, people like to say like, oh, Russia's the India of Europe. I'm seeing this shit now. Like, no.
Kraut's argument is actually almost identical to that of another guy, but that's for a future video. The problem is, most of a while back, I was recommended the YouTube channel Kraut, as he's made a number of videos on Russian history and political culture. In particular, it was asked what I thought of his video called The Origins of Russian Authoritarianism. Well, I considered a video response at the time. Another creator beat me to it. And I'm also hesitant to make something that could be perceived as putting down another creator, since I understand the work Kraut puts into his videos. So I want to stress I mean no offense to Kraut personally. But ultimately, I was convinced to make this response, because I believe the video presents a certain myth about Russian history, which continues to do harm in the present. I'll be showing footnotes on screen throughout, indicating to check the document below for the citation, as well as additional commentary. Speaking of sources, I began by reading Kraut's, and I should probably point out, Kraut's video is adapted pretty heavily from chapter 26 of Francis Fukuyama's Origins of Political Order, with many of its lines being from the book, with some words changed or moved around.
The Russian princes recruited armies of cavalrymen who were paid not in money, but in land, and the peasants on it. However, because there was so much land, control of the land was not as important as control of the people. The Mongols were a tribal people who had no state or legal structures that they transferred over to the people they conquered.
Now, I'm not completely opposed to him adapting a chapter into a video, although in this case, it might have been better to phrase it as such, since at least to me, the implication was that this was Kraut's words and Kraut's theory. The chapter also has some errors.
Yeah, this is a lot of historical channels do this. So, yeah, that's a big problem in the historical community.
Inconsistencies, which Kraut then repeats, or as a result of changing words around, he introduces some new ones.
By the 1700s, the Russian state was far more centralized than any of its European counterparts, but far more underdeveloped in economy and bureaucracy. There were no regional political structures tied in accountability to a central state. Instead, rule of local provinces was handed out by the Tsar in so-called kormlinye, which means feedings, and the name kinda gives away the predatory nature of the political institution itself.
Elsewhere, Kraut says only 9 families survived Ivan the Terrible, which is from Fukuyama, who himself cites this from Bloom. But if you follow the citation, Bloom doesn't actually say this. The closest I could find was much later, when Bloom says 9 of the wealthiest Romanov magnates were descended from old princely families. So Fukuyama maybe misremembered this, and then Kraut got it from him. However, Kraut also claims to have read Bloom, but didn't notice the discrepancy. But to be charitable, it's possible that Kraut used Fukuyama for the Ivan line, and Bloom for a different part of the video, or simply missed the contradiction between the two. In either case, the works cited frequently support different conclusions, or even contradict the video. The most obvious example being, if it used Razumovsky for the negatives of Mongol rule, then it ignores the several pages before or after, which would complicate or disprove the claims made. Now, I also recognize YouTube videos have more casual standards, but the impression I get is that the channel seeks to be a pretty educative source of information. So my suggestion is, if not actual footnotes, perhaps consider a mention in the video when a section draws heavily from a source. But to reiterate, Kraut can be whatever kind of channel he wants and do whatever he wants with it. I bring this up because it changes the context of the video. But since I don't want this to turn into a whole review of Fukuyama, I'm only going to critique the video as is, regardless of who's behind an idea. And
this is one of the reasons why I am teaching myself Russian. Freaking English. I don't read anything about Russian history in English because you get shit like this. It'll be much more better to just read it in Russian to avoid any fucking translation errors that you would get like this. Really and truly, that goes for any language. But me being someone who is extremely interested in Russian history and Russian culture, reading it from an English person's perspective that sounds weird, right? So this is why I never I thought about it, but I'm like, nah, there's no point in reading books about this. Like, just, it'll take long, but it'll be worth it in the end. So, and I still am progressing, so I haven't brought that up in a while, but believe me, I am very much progressing in my Russian language learning journey, despite the fact that it's me and only me teaching myself.
And while we're on the subject, these are all fairly old works without clear indication of how they're used. Old doesn't necessarily mean valueless, but since our understanding of history is always updating and hopefully improving, relying on only old works can give a stunted understanding. As the video touches on about 1,000 years of history, I won't be addressing everything here, and I'm primarily focusing on the first tenet of the argument, that it was the Mongols who caused or beget Russian authoritarianism. This is a very old theory, and a highly contentious one, which has at best been highly modified, if not outright discarded in modern scholarship. This will also be a jumping off point, where I'll be introducing some history of the Tataryoke in general, as over the course of several future videos, we'll see how this idea has been used across history. To begin, I want to give a note on terminology and some background. It bears repeating that the Russian state did not exist at this time, and is not interchangeable with the Kievan Rus, which is a modern historiographical term. It's generally frowned upon to refer to an uppercase R Russia here, let alone using the Russian state anachronistically, not least of which because the Kievan Rus is, if anything, a shared predecessor to multiple modern nations. Even calling the Kievan Rus a state at the time of the Mongol conquest is a bit arguable, calling it not that much different from other European states, even more so. The Kievan Rus really defies any modern terminology, and our sources don't refer to any single name for such a thing. At one end of the spectrum, Kivelson and Sunni argue there was never a fully constituted Kievan state, as there was no political unity or control over fixed boundaries. And Shepard and Franklin write, there was no unitary state by any reasonable definition. There was no fixed hierarchy of power, no central structure of administration. Yet there were clearly affinities between the dynastic lands, which set them apart, collectively, from their neighbors. Essentially, the Kievan Rus, especially by this time, might be better understood as a loose amalgamation of separate polities, with some sense of shared identity, in which principalities fought and allied with each other, and with those outside. And it might be better said that the most prominent authorities were various dynasties, like the Muscovite of Vladimir, who intermittently ruled both Kiev and Novgorod. The Kievan Rus error may rest in the fact that Kraut's source largely skips over the late Kievan period, focusing more so on the Kievan Rus of 2 centuries prior, when they were described as a smaller and more unified entity. Yet all this to say, by painting the Kievan Rus as a so-called typical state beforehand, it makes the differences after the Mongol arrival seem more attributable to them. Which brings us to the start of Kraut's video.
Yeah, and this is a big problem that I see. I'm gonna be doing this all video. I'm just gonna let the video play for a while, let it play, and then give my take. A lot of people really don't understand Kievan Rus, right? It's funny because you see this a lot with Ukrainian people, right? This is not me hating on Ukrainian people or anything. This is just something that I see everywhere with like so many Ukrainian people. They'll be like, oh, Ukraine was around before Russia. And that's not true. Every time I tell people this, I'm like, yeah, that's not true. I'm like, Kievan Rus wasn't Russia. It wasn't Ukraine. And it wasn't Belarusia either. It was the ancestor. It was the ancestor of all of those countries, right? And even then, like what he said, it's like the best way to describe Kievan Rus is like a extremely loose confederation. And even then, a confederation is still more centralized. Even though the whole point of a confederation is to not be centralized. But that's the best English definition that I could think of to describe Kievan Rus is extremely loose. Like, I wouldn't even call it a confederation, but that's the best way to look at it. Extremely loose confederation where these people just, there was no, again, nationalism is a very modern term, right? You know, I see all these Ukrainian people who try to fix their freaking national identity to this, and then they do it to Cossacks. I'm like, that's not true. Like, you go back in the past, and you go to these people and be like, oh, you're Ukrainian. They'll look at you weird. There was none of that. There was no Russian. No, it's basically what he said, man. None of that nationalism existed. These people were literally just essentially affiliated with whatever kingdom that they just so happened to literally spawn in, aka be born in. And it's just annoying just seeing so many people just not understanding that. Like, I'll see people say like, oh, Ukraine was around before Russia. That's not true. And they'll give the date of when Kiev was founded. And this brings me on to another thing. The term Kievan Rus is a modern term. I don't know why so many people don't know that. It blows my mind. You know, I don't even like to call it Kievan Rus. I actually call it the first Rus state. Even then, calling it state is a stretch, like what he explained. I think the more accurate way would be to say the first Rus entity, right? I think that's a more accurate definition. Because Kievan Rus, that's not even, like, it was centered in Kiev, yes, but it wasn't Kiev. Kiev was not where it was. Like, the first Rus state was not even founded in Kiev. That's not where it began. It began in Novgorod like a good 40 years before it was moved to freaking Kiev. So it's hilarious whenever I hear like Ukrainian people say like, oh, Ukraine came before Russia, and they'll put the date where the capital of the first Rus state was moved from Novgorod to Kiev, and they'll be like, that's the founding. Like, no. And the fact that so many people, not just Ukrainian people, just so many people that distorts that type of history, confidently distorts that type of history, it blows my mind. It really blows my mind. And more people really need to call that shit out. Really and truly. It's just, oh my gosh, bro. But yeah, that's my take on that. So yeah, I do agree with him. I do 100% agree with him.
Most lived in isolation, unbothered by neighboring empires who saw their lands as worthless.
This is a pervasive myth about nomadic pastoralists. They were not isolated. By necessity, they can't be. The peoples of the steppe tended toward highly specialized, non-autarkic economies, requiring interaction with sedentary peoples for any agricultural or handicraft goods that they could not otherwise produce themselves. Their specialization and the inherent instability in the nomadic economy incentivized a heightened interest in trade. By economic necessity, nomads were brought to the sedentary peoples, and by social necessity for the benefits that interaction could confer onto elites. And when trade didn't produce the desired result, then came conflict. Given the close proximity of these two zones, then, it could be better understood as a frontier, blurring the line between the two. Nomads were hardly unbothered in land seen as worthless then. In regards to the land itself, acquisition of cultivated land and other non-pastoral forms of production were key ways of social differentiation, and likewise, acquisition of new land benefited the sedentary Rus. But second, the steppe was a zone of economic interaction, commanding trade routes which generated wealth for those who controlled them and for those who raided them. The Volga Bulgars, for example, were a linchpin connecting the Rus to Southeast Europe and Inner Asia, leading to both trade and warfare. By at least the 12th century, the steppe was a consistent part of the Kievan Rus system, in the sense that nomads were called up as allies and kinsmen by certain princes against others. Most glaringly were the Cherny Klabuki, a confederation of nomadic peoples who entered the service of the princes and even garrisoned Kiev. In the other direction, consider the dozens of wars of Vladimir Monomakh, Andrei Boголюбski's crusade against the Bulgars, or even the war of his nephew Yuri just before the Mongol arrival. Or consider their outposts shown on Kraut's map. Or even in this visual, there wasn't exactly nothingness after all. All this to say, the steppe, including under the Mongols, was not as alien to the Rus as implied. This was the modus vivendi in 1223, when the Mongols first arrived and defeated a Rus Polopsvian army at Kalkia River. They returned in 1237, and over the course of the next few years, waged a conquest of the Rus principalities. Thereafter, the Mongols, later through its subsidiary and successor, the Golden Horde, embedded themselves in the Eurasian steppe, while establishing an indirect suzerainty over the Russian forest region, lasting over the next 2 centuries. Collectively, this state of affairs became the Tatar yoke. Anyway, let's proceed with how Kraut characterizes the Mongols.
There's a tendency amongst modern
Also, just a quick note, these nomadic people, because I have reacted to so much Turkic history at this point that it's like, yeah, that's just saying that these people were isolated is so not true. I mean, for goodness sakes, these nomadic people use horses. I mean, this is water is wet logic, bro. If they use fucking horses, of course they're not going to be isolated. That's doesn't take a genius to just, put 2 on 2 together. Wait a minute, these people, they horse is literally their main thing. Surely, horses are pretty fast. They could get you to different places pretty quick. Like, come on now. That's this is the problem with Kraut. I'm just gonna let the video play.
historians to paint the Mongol Empire in a positive light.
To be clear, the modern historians don't deal in good and bad. They deal in understanding and contextualizing why and how things happen. And this isn't to wipe away brutality or devastation. The Mongol conquests were of course highly destructive, leading to the brutal sacking of many cities, severe depopulation, and a lot of suffering after. And with that said, for centuries, the Mongols were painted in a specifically negative light, based on racial stereotypes and a lack of evidence which we now have. So the modern historians aren't trying to whitewash the Mongols, they're trying to advance our understanding beyond black and white.
The Mongols were a tribal people who had no state or legal structures that they transferred over to the people they conquered.
The Mongol Empire can't be generalized to just a tribal people.
What? I'm not even gonna say no way that he said the second largest empire in history, right? This Mongols the second largest empire, I think, right? Behind the British Empire. Either second or third largest. I think it was the second largest empire. Either second or third largest empire. No way he said no.
Nor did they lack state or legal structures. And
Whoa,
they
okay.
did transfer things to the people they conquered. In fact, that's a key point to the theory. Kraut doesn't clarify what definition of state he's using and why the Kievan Rus was a state and the Mongols are not, but at a minimum, the Mongols are usually described as a state before leaving modern-day Mongolia. In either case, the Mongol Empire and its successors underwent considerable development after. Focusing on the Golden Horde, they created a centralized state with complex administrative institutions, incorporating ideas and talent from across the empire. Notably, after the conversion to Islam, they fused Mongol administrative practices and the Yasa legal code with the highly sophisticated Islamic divan system. They built new cities, which became centers of trade, manufacturing, and agriculture, and a permanent urbanized bureaucracy for administration over their territory. Based on context, Kraut seems to be using tribal and a lack of statehood to signify the Mongols had no political organization or institutions to give, but that's not the case at all. Their ability to integrate all sorts of institutions was among their greatest strengths. Although Kraut similarizes the Mongols with other steppe nomads, it's also important to consider how they were different, namely how they created states after these conquests, which could last centuries. Later, Kraut adds,
Because the Mongols had brought no legal code of limited aristocratic power,
outside Fukuyama, I've been unable to find in Kraut's sources this idea that the Mongols had no legal code or incentivized wanton extractiveness. In actuality, the Mongols had laws and limited the power of officials. They did raid the Rus lands, but like other nomads, they also recognized pretty intuitively that it was better to have a region steadily produce for you than to constantly be desolating it. And so Chinggis Khan and his successors often issued decrees prohibiting uncontrolled pillaging. As one example, at the Kurultai of 1269, it was reiterated that immoderate exploitation, or any taxation except where specified, was banned, along with trespassing on arable land and interference in local governance. This is not to say the rules were never broken, but it's to show this idea of them not even trying to have law and order has no basis in reality. Now let's talk about those economic effects. Kraut doesn't really cover this aspect, but the Mongols also gave rise to recovery and economic growth after their conquest, and actively cultivated as much, which had a major effect on production, commerce, demographics, and urbanization among the Rus, even if only motivated by self-interest. Relevant here is that the Mongols connected the region to new trade routes and also expanded and redirected existing trade routes in their favor. Trade was then also strengthened by the Mongols building outposts and stations, forming treaties, creating a postal system, and most importantly, by protection of merchants. And this was streamlined because rather than the Rus having to make deals with one group to protect against another, they were all now, at least in theory, united under one tax-free Mongol guaranteed roof. This so-called Pax Mongolica led to increased trade and settlement in and with the steppe. Another prominent argument is that the Rus were completely cut off from the outside world because of the Mongols, which Kraut somewhat alludes to. First of all, I get that this is only a loose map, but the cities mentioned are pretty far off the mark. More importantly, this point is misconstrued. There was arguably a shift away from Kiev already beginning before the Mongols. The city had been sacked multiple times in the century before, and Andrei Bogolyubsky had transferred the Grand Princedom to Vladimir after 1169. Many Rus cities were in the northeast already, so I wouldn't write it off as only a backwater. Because of the reorientation of trade, if you're going to make any generalization, it should be that opportunely placed cities were the ones that prospered and could outpace poorly located older cities. There's no one-to-one correlation between areas devastated by the Mongols and areas most impoverished. Susdalia was one of the hardest hit regions by the conquest, and yet it was a city out of Susdalia, Moscow, that rose to predominance. Conversely, Smolensk was not as badly affected by the conquest, and yet lagged behind. The Mongols exacerbated the trend away from Kiev, although created trends in other directions as well. And while Kraut implies these were landlocked, isolated places, we shouldn't forget the importance of rivers and overland trade. It was precisely this advantageous position for commerce and communication which contributes to Moscow's emergence as a powerful state. Likewise, urbanization did occur. For the reasons mentioned, it was indirectly promoted by the Mongols. As for cut off from the outside world, this doesn't bear out. For one, the Rus were now connected to a massive continent-spanning empire and regularly were in contact with it. Our accounts state, and archaeological evidence now supports, that the Rus made frequent trips to the Mongol cities and lived and worked among them. The increase in international commerce exposed the Rus to new luxuries, as evidenced by the discovery of exotic goods, even among Rus villages. That said, the implication is really that they were cut off from Europe. But how cut off were they? The Mongols revived trade with the Byzantines, which for various reasons had begun to decline in the century prior. We also know the Byzantines were still sending metropolitans, churchmen, books, etc. as before. Therefore, I don't agree that
ties with the Byzantines were now broken.
If anything,
All right, let's before he talks about Byzantine Empire, yeah, that's another thing that a lot of people just really need to understand. You'll see like all these people say like, oh, bro, Kiev. Oh my gosh, bro. Kiev was like the bustling center of the first Rus state. Or they'll say Kiev was the bustling center of Kievan Rus. And, I always tell these people, I'm like, yeah, but Kiev literally became a dump. It literally became a rump city. And the other cities, like literally what he said, eventually just took its place. That's literally what happened. If you know anything about this type of history, which I'm assuming that you do, that's literally what happened. That's literally what happened, bro. What happened in Novgorod was the first. Okay, Novgorod is literally the father of all Rus cities. It's literally called the father. Then there was Kiev. It was moved. The capital was moved from Novgorod to Kiev. Right, and Kiev is called the mother of all Rus cities, and it was moved again to like what he said, Vladimir, and because Kiev was falling off, but Moscow would eventually just surpass everything, right? So eventually Moscow would just come to just be the overall dominant place that would just come to be the center of everything. So again, we see this pattern. We see this pattern of, the center of, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, center of, I don't know. What's the English word I'm looking for? The center of authority, or the structural center of Rus keeps on moving, okay? Like, or I could just better say the center of Rus just keeps on moving until eventually Moscow would just completely succeed everything. Moscow would just completely succeed everything, man. So this is why it just annoys the living shit out of me when people it completely distorts his history. And they act like Kiev was like forever the center of Rus when that wasn't the case, right? Like, we all know that wasn't the case, and so many people just need to hear this more. Like, literally, there's so many people need to hear this shit more. It wasn't even the original center. It was an important center, but again, due to changing times, of course, places are just gonna move, man. Shaking my head. Jesus have mercy, man. And Kiev, it was still like significant, due to its past, due to the fact that it was, it's called the mother of all Rus cities. Like, but it still fell off. Its cultural significance was still there, but it economically speaking and all that, it fell off. Like, it just fell off. It lagged behind, and Moscow would eventually just come to just take its place, So, like I said, Russia is not Kiev Rus, but it's the successor or descendant, more so better. Ukraine is also Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia. They're all descendants, i.e., you could say descendants or successor to Kievan Rus, but Moscow. But none of these countries, like Russia, was the first descendant, really and truly, like the first from Ukraine and Belarus and all of them to really and truly come out, right? So, really and truly, I would say it wasn't just a descendant. I would say really and truly more so that Russia is the successor to Kievan Rus, really and truly, because Ukraine came from Russia. Ukraine came from Russia. Without Russia, without the Tsardom of Russia, which would later turn into the Russian Empire, you would not have a Ukraine, right? So, and where did the Tsardom of Russia come from? Well, it came from the fragmented First Rus state, right? fragmented, subjugated First Rus state.
It's the opposite. The Golden Horde had good relations with the Byzantines, meaning by getting close to the Mongols, the Rus were remaining close with Constantinople. These cultural ties were never exactly broken. Then there was the growing Baltic trade, the communiques and occasional marriage proposals, and as we'll see in another video, the intricate interaction between the Rus and the papacy during the Tatar yoke. Therefore, they were largely in contact here at least as much as before. As for extractive institution, this is evidently language from the book Why Nations Fail. For now, I just want to note, the book recognizes that successful institutions aren't historically predetermined. They're contingent, they can be reversed. Likewise, it recognizes that by and large, every state in the 13th century was incredibly extractive, Mongols or otherwise. In their words, Europe had a highly extractive system. No doubt this would apply to the Kievan Rus, given that their socio-economic system was largely based around literal extraction of tribute. Why Nations Fail seems to implicitly reject the Mongol theory, as from their perspective, Eastern and Western Europe were virtually at the same starting position despite Mongol rule. Although the book asserts truly non-extractive, inclusive institutions don't really appear until the modern era, similar to the Rome example, one might apply the book to the Mongols by looking at how they fostered inclusive institutions in their time, despite also having an extractive system. Another approach might be if and how the cultural, economic, and technological transfer out of Asia that the Mongols facilitated contributed to the rise of European institutions. Regardless, the Tatar yoke and the Pax Mongolica do not need to be mutually exclusive. There's no disputing that the Mongols extracted tribute from their subjects, but they simultaneously enabled increased economic growth and positive institutions as well, which generated substantial wealth for the Rus in spite of the tribute. So in sum, the Kievan Rus already had an extractive system, which the Mongols reoriented, but were mostly agnostic about. And like Rome over Britain, they created some partially inclusive institutions in the meantime, but the empire also didn't determine their history thereafter. Speaking of which, let's talk about Novgorod. We'll come back to this later, but one of the main points of Kraut's argument is that there were these two clearly available paths to go down: the Mongol-influenced despotic Moscow, and the commercial, western-facing and democratic Novgorod, and unfortunately, Russia went down the former. Kraut's argument is actually almost identical to that of another guy, but that's for a future video. The problem is, most of the details Kraut presents in support of this narrative are incorrect. For one thing, Novgorod was most definitely subordinated to the Mongols. Kraut unwittingly harkens here to a romantic myth surrounding the city, created in the centuries after, that it had been miraculously spared any Mongol presence. And there is a kernel of truth to this. Novgorod wasn't sacked during the initial Mongol conquest.
Right.
But it seems to have surrendered by accepting a new overlord in, which it had a long tradition of doing. And for the record, Novgorod was far from the only city to not be sacked. Many cities did some variation of this. We know it was subordinated though, because Novgorodian chronicles began to speak about paying the tribute to the Mongols, the tax collectors entering the city, and various interventions in Novgorodian politics within a decade or two after the conquest, and thereafter. So relevant here is that if collecting Mongol tribute is really what made Moscow extractive, we would expect it to have also made Novgorod extractive, since they at least have that in common. Next, Kraut calls Novgorod an important part of the Hanseatic League of Cities, although implies this was before or until the Mongols came. But this isn't quite true, and the presentation is backwards. Novgorod wasn't a member of the Hansa, in the sense of being politically integrated. It's commonly associated with the Hansa because it was home to an important contour, which was like an embassy for German merchants. And although trade and individual agreements went back much earlier, Novgorod's ingratiation to the Hansa was largely after its vassalage to the Mongols was established. Plus, the early Hansa was quite different. Riga had only just been founded, and it and Bremen didn't join the Hansa until decades later. The transition of the Hansa into the more formal political League of Cities wouldn't occur for another century. The famous treaty with Novgorod, called Nyber's cross-kissing, was 4 decades after that. So any argument that Novgorod was unique due to its relationship with the Hansa needs to contend with that being concurrent with the Mongols. Secondly, we need to consider how the Mongols aided Novgorodian trade, including with the Hansa. The Mongols oversaw and honored agreements made by the principalities with their neighbors and encouraged Novgorod's mercantile success.
Slaves. I like that detail.
Novgorod was never
I like that small detail
isolated from the rest of Europe by the Mongol yoke. In fact, the Mongols seem to have encouraged Novgorod's trade with the Baltic. And of course they would. They would want more wealth to go through Novgorod and thus to them. For example, in one decree, Mongu Timur commanded Novgorod to not obstruct Baltic trade and to welcome in the Germans. And the Golden Horde also gave tax exemptions to Hanseatic merchants coming in through the city. And that said, this idea of a pro-Western Novgorod versus an Eastern-facing Moscow, once proposed in the 1960s, doesn't really bear out either. For one thing, our sources don't indicate that Novgorod had any special interest in the institutions or affairs of their Western neighbors. Novgorod traded with the Hansa, but didn't seek affinity with them, hence also the many wars between them. In addition, Kraut's framing might give the false impression of a humane Novgorod destroyed by the brutal Moscow. But this is a little reductive, and to be clear, Novgorod was also famous for its own sackings and slave raids, in which they did much of the same. Next, the romanticization of Novgorodian democracy doesn't really bear out either. The Vicha wasn't a parliament. It was a loosely organized body for approval or consensus, whose emergence as a somewhat formal, distinct institution appears in our sources only around the early 1400s, and which at the best of times, only a political minority could take part in. For this reason, the city is usually regarded as an oligarchy. And while Kraut describes the ideal Vicha in theory, as on page 59 of a history, the following page explains the city largely became controlled in practice by a small group of wealthy lords, who effectively eliminated any power the Vicha could have had. Nor was this democratic accountability or checks and balances in the modern sense. The so-called elections need to be viewed in the context of Rus history, in which conflict between princes almost always imposed on Novgorod who would be elected. And if unelected, princes didn't always acquiesce, as seen for example in the Alexandrovich civil wars. This rule by the nobility, as well as major wars with the Hansa, destabilized Novgorod and aided its eventual conquest, with a significant part of the city supporting Moscow over its oligarchy. So while the video narrativizes the conflict as the despotic Moscow extinguishing democratic Novgorod, the real conflict doesn't break down as neatly. And to be clear, Vicha existed not just in Novgorod. Not only were there a few other republics similar to Novgorod, Vicha also appeared across this region in a less institutionalized or infrequent role. One famous example was the Vicha called in Moscow in 1382. That's after some 150 years of Mongol rule, and in the despotic belly of the beast itself. There's no evidence, by the way, of the Mongols being against Vicha as a concept. So at the least, it's hard to argue this tradition was deliberately snuffed out by them. Now let's talk about the...
Alright, yeah. The Mongols... You could honestly say... You could argue that the Mongols indirectly united, not really, but I say indirectly unite all the Rus into one entity of sorts. Not really, because they were still, at odds with each other. But they laid the foundations of it, right? It's kind of like how you had the Indian subcontinent, and Britain would come and literally vassalize all of it, the British East India Company, because a lot of people tend to forget that was how Britain, not even Britain, but a freaking company conquered India. It's the same logic. Right? It was the whole Indian subcontinent was a whole bunch of vassals all bunched to one. And when Britain left, Britain kind of just decided to just make it all into a state, right? Even though it didn't have to be like that. But obviously the Mongols didn't do that shit. Obviously not. But I see some parallels here, really and truly. very striking similarities between the way how the Mongols had clumped all the Rus states together and the way how the British clumped all of the Indian principality states, essentially just using them as tribute, just like how the Mongols did to the Rus. And without that, really and truly, you wouldn't have India today. And without the Mongol and Tatar I would say you wouldn't really have Russia today. That was a very, in my personal opinion, a very vital point. An extremely vital point. And honestly, I would even go as far as to say a very critical point in what would eventually pave the way for the Russian identity. Because defeating the Tatars and getting rid of the Tatar yoke really like solidified that identity, like we see throughout history, we have like these big wars, right? That usually solidifies this country's like identity, like the 100 Years' War for the English, World War II for like Australia, right? A lot of wars, like the American War of Independence, or the American Civil War really like nailed that American identity in, right? So yeah, really interesting. I don't like what Kraut was saying there. They're talking about Mongol dystopia. No, the Mongols actually helped pave the way for Russia. Okay, if he already explained the whole trade and all that, I don't need to do that. But literally that plus what I just said, you get Russia. Like that literally the building blocks of Russia right there. So there's nothing more to say, really and truly.
The idea of assimilation.
The nomads turned into what they had conquered.
This can be true, although not exactly as a rule, nor is it unique to nomads. When an exogenic minority ruling class replaces a previous one by conquest, they may by necessity adopt elements of the conquered culture in order to effectively govern that which they conquered. If I'm nitpicking, Kraut's examples leave a lot to be desired, as they're not really showing clear assimilation, or play a little fast and loose with terms. I can allow the China example, although maybe it should be said that was a deliberate policy by Kublai Khan, with great resistance from within, and alienating Mongolia proper and the majority Mongol population. Regardless, in building up to the reveal of Russia as the big exception, some of the examples are exaggerated, while ones that contradict are left out. And it's actually not that exceptional. The Mongols did assimilate in part to those they conquered here, but that is to say, the Turkic and Islam practicing peoples of the region they actually settled in. As we noted, they had an indirect suzerainty over the forest region, quite simply because they didn't need to be any more direct. The Rus were tangential to their interest, in that direct control wouldn't advance much additional wealth, so they were less ingratiated in the local administration and had less need to borrow from them. Regardless, after establishing the Mongols earlier as despotic and lacking legality, Kraut then argues that if Russia is those things, it's because they assimilated to the Mongols. But let's examine this claim then that the Mongol despotism beget Russian despotism. We're referring to a system in which a sole ruler has unrestricted power within their realm, and in which it is understood they can and do exercise this power arbitrarily, unfairly, or excessively. For this claim to be true, it assumes or implies a few things. That the Mongols were despotic in the first place, that they transferred this despotism to the Rus, that they didn't transfer things to the contrary, that the Rus after were therefore like the Mongols, that the Rus couldn't plausibly be this way without them, that they perhaps had no capacity for despotism before, and that the Rus presumably had to become this way thereafter. However, essentially every single one of these points can be disproven. First, the popular conception of the despotic Mongols just doesn't conform to reality. The Mongols had no such tradition of despotic control, with their institutions developing from the highly decentralized political culture of the steppe. in which leadership tended to be fluid and dispositional. Concentration of power in the hands of one person was an alien concept, and decisions were traditionally rendered in a conciliar, non-autocratic fashion. Though the Mongols formed an empire, it was in turn influenced by these concepts, and with authority widely delegated. Decentralization could be called a defining characteristic of Mongol rule. Territories were highly regionalized away from central authorities, with China, for example, being divided into a far higher number of subdivisions and tiers than ever before, with a dual administrative structure in each to separate powers between officials. They also deliberately decentralized the military, granting authority to regional secretariats in a departure from how the Song dynasty maintained direct control over all military at the provincial level. This tendency is also clear in how the empire itself was divided and ruled through existing power structures and institutions. In our case, the Golden Horde ruling indirectly through the Rus princes. And crucially, the powers of the Khans were limited by such institutions as the Council of State and Kurukai Beys, ruling with the Khan and having the power to unseat him. One of the more famous versions of the Mongol theory, Wittfogel's Oriental Despotism, assumes the Mongols acquired this practice from China and then transferred it to Russia. But there was no practice of despotism in the first place, let alone in or from China. Second, however we describe the Mongol Empire, they did have administrative institutions to give, but Moscow can't be said to have copied verbatim. Some Muscovite conventions are considered almost certainly of Mongol origin, such as the postal system, various financial and bureaucratic practices, diplomatic norms, and military innovations. But other administrative features of an empire, including most of the legal system, the Islamic Divan, and so on, were rejected. While it's been suggested by some that the rise of Moscow is owed to cooperation with the Mongols, even with influence and opportune cooperation, Moscow also grew beyond the Golden Horde, holding the territory it acquired and building its own administrative institutions, often highly dissimilar from that of its former overlord. Unsurprisingly then, the Muscovite state didn't resemble Mongolia. It used Mongol models where useful, but along with models from numerous other sources, and their own indigenous innovations, refoundings, and combinations. Conversely, other institutions that Moscow did adopt could be called unconducive to autocracy, meaning if derived from the Mongols, they hindered Russian despotism. For example, dual administration may well have been imported. They also appear to have influenced the petition system and the Muscovite style of consensus politics. Speaking of which, this line about the Zemsky Sobor really misses one of the fundamental aspects of Muscovite political culture, which is that it was built around consensus. There was no formalized body or corporate culture in a Western sense, nor were powers legally enshrined. But in short, a boyar council was always at the center of Muscovite politics, wielding real power, signing off on documents, and checking the power of the sovereign. Muscovite ideology was built around this idea of power emanating from an autocrat, although the term itself carried no meaning of unlimited power as we conceive it nowadays, and the actualization of his power relied upon the sovereign being beholden to and maintaining his boyars. Ironically, it was a boyar council that English MP Giles Fletcher witnessed and called Russia's parliament, but the video forgets it entirely. For our purposes here, what's notable is that the structure of the Boyar Council appears to have been based on the Golden Horde administration. And while we're here, this characterization of the Sobor is pretty exaggerated. Though a non-legislative body, it did serve a deliberative function, bringing a larger cross-section of the population into decision-making, including non-aristocrats, and occasionally had significant power and influence in running the country. And as a nitpick, I'm not sure what this date is, but as fans of the election series will recall, he probably meant to put 1907 if anything, when the Stolypin coup occurred. Anyway, as already discussed, the Mongols didn't deliberately target democratic institutions. When they did intervene in politics, it was to take down rebellious or ambitious princes. So in that sense, they were limiting monarchs while not harming the nobility, which is why the late Tatar yoke and just after is sometimes called the Golden Age of the Boyars. It's also why Kraut's claim that the princes were extracting tribute with increased ruthlessness doesn't really work. The Khans basically wanted steady income without any headaches, which would behoove them to enforce reasonability. Embezzlement was a capital offense, and the main charge levied when they dethroned a prince. To what degree any institutions are directly appreciable to the Mongols is disputed, but in either case, it would be wrong to assume institutional borrowing determined the Russian course thereafter. Inheriting a model for administrative bureaucracy does not an autocracy make. Mongol institutions became effective tools for the Muscovite state once arisen, but they did not produce it, nor did they set it in stone. When Kraut says,
The newly independent Russia kept the socio-economic and political structures that had developed under Mongol rule, and strengthened them.
This is absolutely not the case. By the 16th century, Muscovite administrative and cultural ideas diverged considerably, and there was conscious removal or rewriting of so-called obsolete institutions of the Mongol period. Regardless, let's see how Kraut characterizes borrowings.
The Russian princes even adopted the warfare tactics of their conquerors.
The Mongols were the premier military power of their day. It would be incompetency not to learn from them. But for his example, Kraut claims they built wooden forts instead of stone castles. This line harkens to a certain myth in Russian history.
I was reacting to that series, man. Freaking hell, the Russian series, the history of the Romanovs, man. I mean, even then, they literally said that eventually, the Russia would eventually build stone walls and whatnot. So what? But that was like a good couple hundred years after the Mongols. I don't know. This Kraut. I don't know, man. I don't know why people listen to Kraut. I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know why people do that.
But the idea is that the Mongols bombed Russia back into the Wood Age. Firstly, the Rus made use of both wood and stone before and after the Mongols. There was a major decline in new building projects in the approximately 50-year period after the conquest, both from the general devastation and economic downturn, and also the temporary relocation of craftsmen out of the region to the new Mongol cities. But thereafter, illustrating the economic recovery, monumental building projects returned and increased significantly, even more than the pre-Mongol period. Second, we shouldn't necessarily associate wood with more primitive. Even among wooden buildings, the building practices became much more complex over time. Wood also just makes sense in a lot of contexts. This is a region covered in timber, and it also on average gets much colder than Western Europe. So given wood is readily available and better for insulation, wooden buildings would be desirable. Third, if the implication is the Rus learned this tactic from the Mongols, perhaps we should point out the Mongols built huge stone cities, such as Sarai, their city that the Rus would have been most familiar with. Fourth, this idea of Moscow building forts out of wood and burning them down isn't really an accurate reflection of their rise to power. On several occasions in the 1300s, during Moscow's crucial wars for regional hegemony, Lithuania reached the gates of Moscow, but was unable to penetrate its fortified stone walls, built during the Tatar yoke. So it was the fact that they...
that's literally what I was like thinking in my head. I'm like, wait, isn't like the famous Kremlin walls literally made out of stone? And wasn't that built like way before, like it was built super duper early within the Tatar yoke period? Like, so I don't know where the heck Kraut will, I don't know why Kraut will say that. I mean, the one look at the freaking famous Kremlin walls and you would literally be able to see like, yeah, no, these people were clearly building with stone. Like, I'm honestly losing brain cells. I am honestly losing brain cells.
That ensured their success here. Fifth, it appears Kraut makes this distinction that they had no castles, only forts, because later he'll say that a lack of castles shows a lack of a regionalized feudal social structure. However, Russia did have castles, usually wooden but also stone, and built by lords and princes all across the country. The wooden ones don't survive to the present, but some stone ones, especially later or repurposed ones, do survive, and you can see some on screen now. And either way, this seems like a rather arbitrary distinction to me, as I don't see why a wooden fort couldn't serve the same function. And evidently, Russia had regionalized social structures. Now, Russia of course had its own unique elements and peculiarities, but it seems to me that for the purpose of Kraut's argument, Russia fulfills the important aspects of the comparison. There were the numerous independent polities that we've already mentioned, each with their own aristocracies. There were the regional appanage and service principalities under the Grand Duke. There were powerful dynasties who had hegemony or property over large parts of the country, like the Trubetskoys of Trubchesk, the Mikolinskis of Tver, any number of houses on the Lithuanian border, the Chingizid Principality of Kasimov, or even the Stroganovs in the Urals. There were the countless clans and local elites who ruled regional estates and administrations, and they were joined by thousands of prominent Pomeshchik families, which Kraut alludes to. There was the Danilovich Civil War, fought partially between nobles along regional lines. There was the long tradition of fortified monastic compounds, which fulfilled a similar role to a castle town, but for the church, and each with their own network of servitors and dependents, becoming important regional players in their own right. There were even Sasikas and their regional network of fortifications across the steppe. So I'm gonna have to push back on this idea that there were no regional structures or castles offering protection. They did exist, and had a major impact on Muscovite development. Although I'm not covering Ivan here, I want to return to that line about the 9 surviving families real quick, because it's highly deceptive and indicative of the problem. The implication is that there were tons of families, and then Ivan killed all but 9, that there were virtually no aristocrats left. But first, in the telephone game of sourcing, it goes from few of the old princely families remained, to only 9 of the old princely families were left alive, to of the many aristocratic families of Russia, only 9 survived, which is a pretty major jump. The princely families were a small subset of the upper aristocracy, not representative of the whole. So this is sort of like interpreting the line, few presidential cabinet members were retained, as barely any politicians were left in the United States. And second, if Kraut was thinking of the major boyar families, throughout Muscovite history, they tended to fluctuate naturally between 5 and 15, as families came and went. So even if there was a drop to 9 major families, that would actually sound pretty standard. It might be better to look at the total number of people in the Boyar Council. During Ivan's reign, the council increased unprecedentedly, then dropped back down, only to explode under the Romanovs. So evidently, Ivan didn't extinguish aristocracy as the video implies. Speaking of which, there's the topic of the Black Death and feudalism in Russia, which is likely a topic big enough for its own video, but I'll discuss a couple relevant points now. In my opinion, the importance of the Black Death and other factors discussed are more defensible positions, but there's still quite a few problems with how Kraut goes about it.
In fact, there is debate among historians if Russia experienced medieval feudalism at all.
This century, the debate is on if feudalism itself even existed, or at least if it's productive to continually try to fit different societies across Europe, with all their nuances and exceptions, into the very non-medieval, nebulous construct that is feudalism. In short, many of the generalizations or models said about feudalism in the video aren't really substantiated or used anymore, at least not as universal concepts. There was no coherent quote-unquote system of feudalism across Europe. And even still, it would be a vast generalization to group all of so-called Europe together in contrast to Russia, despite a diversity of political systems and responses to the Black Death here. Responses which didn't break down along the ideological or social composition of governments. So saying the Black Death caused Europe to begin paying peasants and Russia to begin clamping down on peasants would at best be reductive, assuming it was true. Kraut is getting at something real here, which is that per capita incomes, as well as labor productivity, generally increased after the Black Death, although not invariably or uniformly, and this largely reversed by 1500. Among other factors, the post-plague boom is because while population dropped, the means of production stayed the same. Additionally, while true in spirit, it's not just that peasants went from working for protection to working for wages. Usually they had some sort of agreement to use the land, and the terms of such agreements were being lessened. So peasant income was also increasing because they were paying the owners less. For the growing subset that were hired labor, they saw the rate of pay increase explicitly. But that said, the frequent response initially was not to pay these higher wages, but to clamp down. Most famous are the Ordinances of England, in which after the Black Death, and over the next century after, the crown banned higher wages, curtailed mobility, prohibited the enticing away of workers, and allowed any able-bodied person to be forced into service labor. Although in time the English laws largely failed, similar laws appeared across Europe, of varying severity, longevity, or effectiveness. On the other side of the equation, the main problem with the argument is that encirclement in Russia occurred centuries after the Black Death. In the 1300s and 1400s...
Yeah, that's... Yeah, I'm like, what the fuck is he talking about? Like serfdom is literally like early modern history type of ordeal.
It was generally free movement of peasants, and rulers encouraged as much by their policies. Due to higher demand for labor, lords here also competed to attract peasants to their lands, with owners compelled to give in to what the peasants wanted. Attempts were made to curtail movement. However, unlike say England, there was no countrywide law banning mobility, only one-off charters granted to individual estates or monasteries. And as the frequent rewriting and reissuing of these charters suggests, they didn't really work. For at least the next century or two, restrictions were rare, sporadic, inconsistent, and ineffective. The first partial restriction to emerge, which sought to limit migration to a certain window of the year, didn't coalesce until the very end of the 15th century, and even then wasn't definitive. And at this time, in a reversal of the Kievan era, the law stipulated peasants were not impeded for being in debt. Creditors could not compel debtors to work if they left. The encirclement which Kraut describes took place gradually, and especially after 1649, so about 3 centuries after the Black Death. Not only was Moscow unable to strictly tie the peasants to the land yet, maybe even less so than in Western Europe, its relative wealth from trade and the like meant it didn't have to. It had the flexibility to lower taxes and restrictions, and thus entice peasants into its lands from neighbors. Moscow's strength was in growing its available manpower faster than others, by incentivizing immigration, buying labor, relocation and colonization, donating land to the church, which was a colonizing force in its own right, and recruiting and better integrating foreign populations, like the Tatars dislodged from the Golden Horde's collapse. And this actually makes for a more consistent argument, because if there was encirclement, we would expect it to benefit the landowners and aristocrats, whereas with intensified competition, an already weak aristocracy would be disadvantaged. So rather than Kraut's linear path of increasing state exploitation, the evidence seems to suggest the opposite. And rather than a dichotomy between Europe and Russia, we observe a diversity of reactions all over. Though the ordinances in Western Europe often failed, the point is they were tried. Kraut's narrative suggests that the Russians had a different mentality or set of conditions because of the Mongols that made them clamp down on peasants, while Europe did not. But non-Mongol influenced Europe also tried to clamp down on peasants, and Russia often didn't. Later on, when encirclement did occur, it happened in Poland and Germany as well, despite being outside the Tatar yoke. This is not to say Russia and other countries were the same, it's to say they were similar in their dissimilarity. Therefore, the Mongols and Black Death don't adequately explain the later autocracy. Kraut's argument.
Yeah, that's hilarious, and you know you still see this today. You still see this shit today, bro. Where and a lot of people just don't understand that. Really and truly, there is like no difference between Russia and the rest of Europe, despite what many people say. I do like to say like Russia and America are essentially the same countries, but we're talking about Europe here. People try to paint Russia as this like super different, super like people like to say like, oh, Russia's the India of Europe. I'm seeing this shit now. Like no, it's not. Like where the hell did you even get that phrase from? Russia's the India of Europe. Like no, Oh my gosh, like, but people are just so brainwashed by so much propaganda and what they want to hear. I mean, you get stupid shit like that. Really and truly, like, there's so much things that you could literally just sit there. I'm not gonna sit here and waste my time doing that, because again, this is literally just saying water is wet information / logic. Like, there's, like, yeah, due to certain aspects happening to each countries in Europe, that they ended up going their kind of different route, but overall they're very similar in a lot of ways. There was nothing unique, really and truly, like, overall, like, generally speaking, like, nothing unique about any of them, really and truly. And it's funny because I'm just gonna give like one example of this shit, right? And I even said this on Why is Russia Poor reaction. When I did that reaction, Western Europe, because people like to say, oh my gosh, Western Europe is so much better than Eastern Europe. Dude, Western Europe would be the same as Eastern Europe post World War II, but the only difference was Western Europe had America bail it out. America literally funded the reconstruction of Western Europe. Russia didn't have that privilege. So, me and my friend, we were literally talking about this a while ago. Had America not been there, Western Europe would be in a much worse position, or just the same level as Eastern Europe in terms of living quality of life, wages, all that. Literally, right? Again, this is just water is wet information, but again, so many people just, for some reason, they just don't know it. They just don't know it, but like they act like Western Europe is just superior to Eastern Europe, and they have this superior style of society that is just so much better than Eastern Europe and places like Russia. They say no, you got lucky because America didn't get its ass bombed in World War II. That freaking all of Europe did, that completely ruined their economies, right? So that's just one example of where it seems like, Russia is like different, like so uniquely different from a lot of European countries. But when you dig deeper past that, it's not. They're very similar, very same, really and truly. Like, Russia isn't inferior or anything, or some shit like people like to say.
Argument here is taken from chapter 4 of Why Nations Fail, but it's interesting in how the book differs. The book doesn't attribute the divergence to the Mongols. Instead, they argue serfdom solidified after the Black Death in the East to feed the growth of the West. So while the book explains the development of extractive institutions as part of a nuanced political-economic system which interconnects Russia with Europe and the rest of the world, for whatever reason, Kraut rejects their analysis in favor of Russia being isolated and developmentally abnormal. Kraut's model is also compounded by quite a few misconceptions. First, of the main sort of serfdom that did emerge in this era, not only was it a very small minority of the population, of which 80 to 90% were under a limited service contract, by and large, this was not for peasantry. They were artisans, officials, servants, or soldiers, perhaps showing Moscow's priorities were opposite what the video presents. Next, serfs, when they did develop, weren't actually tied to the land like prisoners, and I mean that in several different ways. For one, in terms of preventing migration, the efficacy of the rules varied by era, but were never definitive. There were also numerous exceptions to the rules, allowing or incentivizing migration to different areas or types of estates, and whole areas without serfdom at all. Together, this meant millions of serfs continued to migrate, despite encirclement. But two, serfdom did not preclude physically leaving the land in general. it didn't adequately prohibit peasants from establishing themselves in towns, and in some areas, a large portion of peasants did. Serfs in practice conducted trade and commerce, owned property and businesses, employed labor, and were employed themselves. So in this sense, restrictions on mobility shouldn't necessarily be taken as synonymous with opposition to urbanization or industry. Even as late as the revolution, most urban workers were peasant migrants or of peasant origins. In short, the Western model, if such a thing existed, is not the only model of historical transformation. While the video presents peasants as leaving the farms and transforming into pure merchants or urban workers, this was not the rule, not in the rest of Europe, and certainly not in Russia. Next, it's important to understand that the Muscovite era was characterized by the breakup of the large patrimonial estates in favor of the smaller and much more numerous pomistia managed by the emerging middle service class. This is important because emerging middle classes often wanted to turn around and become landlords themselves, intensifying serfdom, meaning at least in some Western states, it wasn't just the rise of strong lesser aristocrats defeating monarchs, but the rise of strong monarchs checking the ambitions of the aristocrats that put the final nail in the coffin for serfdom. Or put another way, encirclement is made more likely where the monarch needs the support of the nobility. The development of centralized taxation and standing armies in some Western countries meant their monarchs relied less on nobles, unlike in Russia. What Kraut misses, I think, is that Russian serfdom developed largely at the instigation of the middle and lesser aristocratic classes, and to settle conflicts among them, especially in times of low authority. Notable concessions were made by Boris Godunov in his bid for the throne, and then throughout the time of troubles, which largely destroyed the existing system. Then, soon after, the lesser aristocrats cemented the conversion of their land into permanent hereditary property via the machinations of the Zemsky Sobor. And finally, after frequent petitioning and the major uprising of 1648, the government was forced to accept a new law code written in the Sobor, which solidified encirclement and enhanced privileges for the urban merchants. Essentially, the culmination of serfdom was not simply the autocracy getting more autocratic. It was the government conceding to political blocs which demanded it. Later in the video, Kraut says that actually there were absolutist states in the West too, but these he dismisses as ephemeral. Russia, by contrast, was not only absolutist, but because of a few unique factors, either exacerbated or solidified its absolutism far above the temporarily absolutist West. And apparently it was these primordial factors, not any events or decisions made at the time, which completed Russian authoritarianism. Attributing autocracy to the church was historically the second most popular theory, although not exactly in the way Kraut is going about it. In my opinion, Kraut's version is very generous toward Western Christianity, while being dismissive of Orthodoxy. But put simply, both Catholicism and Orthodoxy can create state-like church structures. Both have the concept of morality and sought to create written codes and ideals. And in both, monarchs in the church sometimes fought. But Kraut doesn't really substantiate how this led to monarchs actually being held accountable, or indeed, how they were held accountable. Numerous popes and anti-popes were directly empowered or overthrown by various monarchs or nobles, and there's countless examples of ignoring or fighting with the church. Fukuyama elaborates that it was the walk to Canossa that marked a turning point in these conflicts. But this leaves out that Canossa was reversed, that the Pope failed to actually control the level of punishment here or after, and also that this high point in papal power was undone in the centuries after. Most especially,
you know, I wanted him to, I was just gonna let him finish talking, but I really, that's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing that Kraut really dismisses how Western Europe was like during the medieval era. Bro, medieval Europe, no one was better than the other in any way. I mean, really, bro? The more I'm thinking about that, the more I'm like, holy shit, bro. Like he did not try to draw a freaking difference between medieval Western Europe to medieval Russia. Oh my gosh. Bro, you could honestly say all of medieval Europe was it's just same or just extremely similar in their systems and whoo. Again, this is just water is wet information. Wow.
Especially when Boniface VIII attempted to solidify and actually use this authority.
I can't believe
Philip IV of
Kraut
France
actually
sacked
said
the
that,
papal
bro.
palace and had him captured. So basically, there are moral standards in every religion, which generally restrained monarchs, but were also broken sometimes. The Pope did not, or could not, actually police every Catholic monarch, and clearly they were not always restrained. Elsewhere, what Kraut is discounting is that Moscow also had moral standards and also had legal codes. It had a participatory legal system used extensively, even by peasants against lords. Kraut is basically only correct in that the law never explicitly subordinated the Russian sovereigns to it, but they aren't unique in that regard, and they were bound by customs, traditions, standards, and practicality. Also, orthodoxy isn't even caesio-papist as a rule. Arguably, in the technical sense, it never was, but I take Kraut's point that historically, state control over the church was quite pronounced. However, if the papacy being separate from monarch control in the pre-modern era determined the Western foundation for law, you may notice that the church was also separate from Russian monarchs in the pre-modern era. That is to say, the church in Russia was coordinated from Constantinople until the mid-15th century. And 2, after an autocephalous church was established, state influence was a gradual, non-linear process. In particular, state control culminated in the abolition of the Patriarchate in the early 18th century. And in this, Peter was specifically trying to emulate the West, as in addition to the interference already mentioned, various absolutist states were bypassing the papacy. In some countries, the monarch outright became the literal head of the church. So, while the argument could be made, in Kraut's argument here, he's reversing causality. Instead of explaining how the church was a precondition for Russian absolutism, what he's describing is more how absolutism affected the church. While we're here, recall that Kraut brushed aside those arguments about religious toleration earlier, but that's a glaring omission here. The Mongols were relatively tolerant of religion, a quality which the Golden Horde retained even when it converted to Islam. Not only that, the church and all such religious institutions, their peasants, and anyone else connected with their lands, was exempt from taxation, and Mongol officials were prohibited from touching any church property or personnel. This contributed heavily to strengthening the Russian church. It led to those state-like structures to compete with monarchs, and as a result, Russia heavily lagged behind Western Europe in secularization of church property. It controlled as much as a third of Moscow's seigneurial land. So he's arguing that Western monarchs were checked by an especially powerful Catholic Church, while leaving out that the Russian Church was especially empowered, that the monarchs couldn't touch it, and that it had the Mongols to thank for that. Even if one considers this not enough to matter overall, by the video's logic, this would seem a way in which the Mongols and the Church deterred Russian authoritarianism. Now as for the army
had been directly recruited by the Muscovite state.
Moscow did rely on the aristocrats, whose retinues made up the vast majority of the army. It was largely decentralized, with nobles not formally obligated to give forces to the prince. This began to change only in the late Muscovite period, and by the later development of a standing army and abolition of private armies in the Tsardom, which parallels similar developments in Western Europe. So it's actually the other way around. The army was not directly recruited under the Muscovite state until after much of the rest of Europe began to do so. And to be clear, they were paid money. Kraut is thinking of the Pomestia system, which emerged pretty late and wasn't a payment in land per se. Initially, these were grants of land with fixed income so that servicemen could outfit themselves, but where they didn't have rights over tenants, if they had any, until well into the late 16th century. Eventually, these lands evolved into the non-conditional hereditary property we mentioned earlier. And Kraut seems to be mistaking the Pomeshchiki as a government standing army when they were not. They were a class of landowners in their own right, which had to be appeased, and contributed a sort of militia to the army, alongside any forces from the boyars or elsewhere. Not until Tsars Alexis and Peter did Russia transition really to an absolutist military structure. And of course, the actual ability to use military force at a given time or target is going to be conditional, and that goes for any country. I think this section underrates that wars require people willing to wage them. The monarch had to cultivate and negotiate loyalties of servitors who voted with their hands in the sabor and their feet on the battlefield, as well as of the boyars who created, funded, and led them. The monarch had to act in coordination with the boyars against another boyar. Not doing so, almost by definition, was civil war. I'll also say that especially around this part of the video, Kraut tends to mix up various different systems, which were sometimes contradictory or existed in different time periods, thus obscuring the many institutional changes that Russia made over time and creating a false sense of linear autocracy. As some other examples,
Rule of local provinces was handed out by the Tsar in so-called Kormlinie.
they were not, as this was abolished at about the time the Tsardom was established. Feedings likely originated in the early Kiev.
You know, this is an intellectual insult. There's no other way to put it. This is literally an intellectual insult. Holy moly. And, you know, this is a big deal because we're going to have people who watch this stuff, who watches Kraut, and like the anti-Russian propaganda, the whole Russophobic garbage is already bad enough as is now. And shit like this I can't pronounce the word. Exacerbate. It makes it worse. It makes it worse. Now, even though if he was, politely, debunking the video, yeah, this is still serious. This is still serious. Okay. This is like on the same damn level of someone cheating to become a surgeon. Like, you don't take that type of shit. You don't kindly look at someone and say like, hey, yo, you can't cheat. Like, no, we're gonna call out that person in a much more serious manner. Like, firmly be like, yo, bro, what the hell are you doing? Like, that's not a joke, man. Like, that's some serious shit. That is on the same level as that, because people are going to take this shit, and I argue with these morons all the time, dude. I swear, I argue with these like anti freaking brainwashed anti-Russian people all the freaking time, and they'll bring up like stupid points like this where they say some nonsense about, oh my gosh, but Russia is just authoritarian state that's going absolutely nowhere and it's not developing at all. Even though that's like, couple research shows that's not the case, right? But most people don't want to do that. Most people don't want to do that at all. I mean, for goodness sakes, man. I mean, why do you think I became so pro-Russia in the first place? I did my research, people. I did a lot of research, actually. A lot of research into this. Because I wasn't always like this. But most people aren't like that, unfortunately. Most people will go sit there and watch, generalized stuff like this, because a lot of them are too lazy to do their own research. And they take it at face value. They have zero critical thinking whatsoever. So that's why this is a big deal. And then what this will translate to is more hatred. Okay, more hatred towards innocent Russian people that don't even deserve it. So
Rus. So this was not a modern creation as Russia centralized. It was something which Russia removed. A feeding, by the way, was an arrangement usually lasting a couple years, where a nobleman would govern a district and manage the prince's properties within it, in exchange for payment in kind from the district. Though peasants weren't tied to the recipient nor the district. And if you think about it, of course they weren't, as feedings weren't permanent themselves. Next.
The new Muscovite state also introduced the mestinestvo.
Well, Miesnichsva was indeed quite conservative. It was a system created to prevent infighting, which already existed, by establishing a set procedure for determining status, integrating new elites, and solving disputes as an alternative to violent feuds. It relied on law and written records, and it enabled nobles to certain privileges and rights. Hence, it could arguably be a hindrance on royal power. And as Russia centralized further, the system was actually abolished, which is not only inconvenient to Kraut's point, but suggests that fundamental changes in political culture and values were also quite possible. That a deeply ingrained institution could be reversed seems to cause this argument to unravel. To quote Kraut,
a mistake often made, though, is to assume that these developments were unavoidable and somehow part of some inner logic of Russian culture itself.
But not just in the sense of there being two deterministic streams instead of one. Russian culture at any point is not set in stone. It's a cumulative synthesis, as well as a continuous process of synthesizing. Yet, one of the problems with the Tataryok thesis is it tends to remove all agency. Are Russians fully thinking humans capable of making their own choices? Or are they destined to be autocratic by something 1,000 years ago? As Noonan points out, having somehow watched Kraut's video back in 1975, the Mongol and Orthodox theses don't synergize well for this reason. Did the Russians want to be connected with the West or not? On the one hand, they apparently actively rejected Catholicism for orthodoxy and other such developments, yet were also held against their will from adopting Western developments? And taking the angle that the Mongols had no laws or institutions to give is odd, because if anything, that's the most demonstrable way that the Mongols could have influenced the early Muscovite state. Once we take that away, we're left with only a nebulous idea that the Mongols changed their mentality or morality in some way. At its
Also, this whole idea of, oh, you need the Western style, like the Western style is the only way to go. You don't. I said this in my, what is it, Rise of China reaction, my Epic History TV. You could go check that out if you want after this. More people need to go their own way. More countries need to do their own thing. You don't just need the West. You don't need the West. That's not true. Number one. Number two, in my humble opinion, and I wouldn't even call this an opinion, but just for the sake of this video, but in my humble opinion, the Catholic Church is extremely corrupted. Okay? I say this plenty of times. So, good on Russia for not following that. Okay? Good on Russia for that. Okay, thumbs up, Russia. So, I don't know, Kraut is giving this idea of, oh, the Catholic Church is the only way, oh, the Western system is the only way. That's just bias, and no, that's just extremely biased. I don't want to use other terms, but because I want the YouTube algorithm think that this video is something else, but I'm just gonna say that's just really biased. And a very narrow way of thinking. So, no, this is one of the reasons why I actually freaking respect Russia, because, it first of all, Russia has taken a lot of Western inspiration, i.e., from the Roman Empire. I mean, it literally tried to style itself as the Third Rome. So the palace in St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace, is a literal copy of the one in Versailles, right? I could go on and on about this, but it takes inspiration, but it still tries to go its own way. It doesn't just completely model itself, and that's hilarious to me. Actually, now that I think about this, because that's just not true what Kraut is saying. That, oh, Russia completely rejected any types of Western stuff. No, because you can see this with the Russian language, where there's so many French words, there's so many French, German words, etc., English words too, in the Russian language, because Russia has been trying to style itself, try to get closer to the West for a lot of its existence, and so So we see that with the language, with all these Western words. I don't know what the hell Kraut is saying here, but Russia today, no, it's not doing that anymore. Like even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation tried to become friends with the West, and the West just flatly rejected that. Mostly America just flatly rejected that for various reasons. But no, I don't know what the hell Kraut is saying. What I'm saying is that I do like the fact that Russia is different. It's different. It's not completely just freaking Western style shit like what a lot of people are doing. Like, no, that's one thing I like about Russia. It's kind of different. Like, yes, I'm aware it has a lot of inspiration, but no, this is just sitting there and, like freaking cocksuck any and everything from the West and style any and everything from the West. Like you don't need that. You don't need that. You could do shit your own way, and Russia is big enough, okay, and it's capable enough where it could do that shit. So I don't know that. Yeah.
Most extreme, this takes a biological claim that Russians are who they are because they have Tatar blood. At its less extreme, but still racist, it takes on a Lamarckian view. He said the word that I didn't really want to say. The racist. It's very racist of Kraut, honestly. That Russians were conditioned over time, that the Mongols made the leaders ruthless, and the people subservient or savage. Yet Rus princes were plenty capable of ruthlessness before, and the opposite after. And the behavior of the Mongols was not some special heinousness far above the standards of the age, as brutality from Western Europeans can attest. While the countless uprisings and revolutions in Russian history seem to imply that Mongol rule didn't cause the Russians to forget the pursuit of freedom after all. The historical Tatar yoke was an unweighable mix of both positive and negative effects, distributed non-uniformly across time and the Russian space. When all is said and done, it is unknowable if the subsequent Russian state developed because of or in spite of the Tatar yoke, or indeed if and how it would have developed in the yoke's absence. But more than that, the Tatar yoke is an idea. The concept of an extraordinary yoke of slavery, which Russia had to triumphantly liberate itself from, was largely crafted after the actual yoke had ended, as part of a new ideological framework, being used to justify the existence of a strong state and to lay claim to non-Muscovite lands. Thus, rather than the Tatar yoke creating the Muscovite state, we can speak of the Muscovite state creating the Tatar yoke, a virtual past helping to justify and bolster the state once arisen, rather than the other way around. The Russian
that's
state-
literally what I was saying earlier in the video. Like, without the Mongols, you would not get Russia. You kind of need the Mongols and the Tatar yoke period to get what we know, and some of us would love, but a lot of people hate Russia. But that's literally exactly what I was saying earlier in the video.
State is not a linear progression from Mongol-laden institutions. Most obviously, when its centralization was taken in part as an act of rejection of the Mongols in favor of what the church perceived as more Byzantine and Christian, and later what monarchs perceived as more European and advanced, with numerous breaks, reversals, and reinterpretations along the way. And indeed, you would think these later events might have had an effect on present institutions, more so than Mongol rule. Yet over time, the Tatar yoke increasingly became the focus and associated with backwardness. At the start of Russian national historiography, it was assumed the Mongols couldn't have done anything but destruction, or at most, only catalyzed the emergence of the strong autocrat, the Tatar yoke having held Russia back. And outside Russia, in spite of the Western influences and visitors in the Muscovite court, a certain stereotype developed, often stoked for geopolitical reasons, that Russians were isolated from Europe, that they were savages, pagans, and barbaric Asians. Oriental despotism itself emerged largely as a metaphor to critique the French autocracy, to say we're not supposed to be like them. In the growing differentiation between a West and an East, this idea of the Tatar yoke struck at the heart of Russian historiography. Questions like, what is Russia? Is it European? Can it be? Has the stain of Asianness made that impossible, for better or for worse? all questions of growing importance in light of colonial conquests and 19th century theories of racial superiority. With Russia being or appearing so different, and with the Tatar yoke being made a uniquely Russian condition, it became the frequently cited explanation, and molded as needed, to say this must be why they're so backwards, inferior, exceptional, abnormal, or what have you. No doubt, Russia is and was a very...
Yeah, and it's hilarious. I remember like 2 years ago at the start of the conflict. Not even the conflict, because the conflict in Ukraine happened like 10 years ago. But when the conflict expanded in 2022, much wider, people were saying that Russia wasn't a European country. Like, you had the Western Europeans and their garbage superiority complex were unironically trying to say that Russia is not a European country. And that Russians are not European. I still see people who say this stupid shit. It's even more hilarious too, because you'll see like people, like I'll be on TikTok or whatever, or like YouTube Shorts, and people will like, I don't know, put like Europe. They'll put like, oh, like some Europe edit or something, and they'll just put like the EU flag, right? They'll put like the freaking EU flag. And act like if that's all of freaking Europe, completely disregarding the fact that Russia is literally half of Europe. Like, I always laugh at like shit like that, bro. This is why whenever I see like some people, some Russian people who are in favor of aligning more to the freaking EU or more to Western Europe, I'm just like, really, like you're kind of foolish, really and truly. That's just my personal opinion. Usually I don't insult Russian people, but if you're the type of Russian who believes that, I think that's just a foolish idea to have. Really and truly, Russia does not need the freaking EU. It's literally half of Europe. Like, it can do its own shit. Oh my gosh, dude. So the amount of discrimination against Russia from these morons, really and truly, it's just quite baffling, and it's hilarious just to see the level of ignorance. Okay, like as much as a lot of you people don't want to hear it, you don't have Europe without Russia. Like you can't have Europe without Russia. Okay, like that's just impossible. Like Europe as we know it, you can't have that without Russia. Russia is a literal core part of Europe, whether a lot of you want to admit it or not. Like it's just absurd and ridiculous.
Very unique state in the pantheon of world states, with its own peculiarities, history, and culture. It has taken turns enigmatic to its peers, as states are often known to do, and more than most states, by the Cold War, it experienced with the full breadth of 20th century interconnected technology what it meant to live disconnected from its peers. Whatever differences there might have been, they could now be amplified and misunderstood like never before. And curiously, medieval history once more had a part to play in this modern spat backed by nuclear weapons. The Tatar yoke idea received a huge new lease of life in the early to mid 20th century, being wielded for various contradictory purposes, but ultimately to say that Russia was, is, and is destined to be completely unlike the rest of the world, completely unlike us. It's a story of intrinsic and irreconcilable differences, papering over the many similarities of history in favor of Tatar predestination, rationalizing despotic, evil, godless communism as a result of despotic, strange, non-European history.
Hilarious, because communism wasn't even... I find that hilarious too, because communism didn't even come from Russia. Communism came from Germany. Karl Marx was a German. He wasn't even Russian. it blows my mind how people like associate communism with Russia, and it didn't even originate from Russia. Like, I find it hilarious how people just tend to forget that Russia literally fought an entire civil war to stop the country from being taken over by communism. People just like forgets that. People just forgets that, man. I'm talking about the Western European people who like what he says here thinks that, oh my gosh, like Russia's this communist dystopia or whatever. Oh my gosh, like I said, it's just hilarious. Okay, the ignorance is just funny. It's honestly just funny. Like, yeah, even Putin himself literally said that you're an idiot if you want the Soviet Union to come back. Putin himself literally said, you are dumb. If you want the Soviet Union to come back, you are dumb. So,
recent events, outdated historiography on Russian despotic otherworldliness has seen a resurgence. A sort of Oriental despotism continues to persist, being used to otherize Russians, but also to condone Russian authoritarianism, or to discriminate against ethnic minorities within Russia. Weaponization against Tatars, weaponization against the Soviets, and weaponization that continues to cast a shadow on Russians despite the efforts of historians to disarm the Tatar yoke and retire the weapons to the dustbin of history. What these arguments obscure is that the Tatar yoke idea had to be written in the first place, and constantly rewritten throughout its history. The view of an inevitable political climate obscures the very real amount of work needed to create and maintain political institutions, whether democratic or otherwise. They aren't just something you either inherited or you didn't. They have to be built, maintained, and defended. In acquiescing to a despotism being inevitable, we only contribute to that despotism becoming insurmountable. But as the continued evolution of the Tatar yoke has shown, historical legacy does not have to determine destiny.
Yeah, it's anti-Russian propaganda and Russophobic nonsense. That's basically what he was. That was his polite way of saying that. Okay, and like, come on, bro. Like, a basic look at Russia's history, honestly, kind of just, you don't even need to dive as deep as he did, really and truly, to just realize like the holes in this theory. Like I already pointed out, like, number one, Russia has tried so hard to model itself after the West so many times, okay, and the West has just completely just rejected Russia. Okay, number two, Russia fought an entire civil war to stop communism from taking over the country. Okay, oh my god, look, I'm done here. I've lost too much brain cells. This is why I'm like, bro, like, holy shit, dude. I just can't. The fact that people just can't do, especially like Europeans, right? Because Americans, they don't really, Americans are notorious for not knowing a lot of information, but like Europeans, right? Europeans, it's who I'm more critical of, because usually they're more historically knowledgeable. So for them to keep on, not all, because I see many Europeans who understand Russia's perspective. Plenty of Europeans who understand Russia's perspective very well. But a lot of them, despite supposedly being historically knowledgeable, repeat a bunch of intellectually dishonest and intellectually insulting garbage about Russia that is just absolutely not true. That unfortunately, innocent Russian people have to suffer just plain racism because of this shit, right? So anyways, if you made it all the way here to the end of this video, make sure you like and subscribe. Go check out my other reactions like this. I have plenty of reactions like this. Like, I don't know, if you like this reaction, you'll go check out my "Why is Russia Poor" reaction, where I basically debunk that nonsense. That's not true. And if you've got any suggestions, like it, just suggest it, comment in the comments below. Eventually I'll go and do it, man. Very long video, but it is what it is. If you're an active viewer of mine, you want to, as I get more people, more subscribers, have more things going on in my life, it's going to be harder for me to keep in touch with everyone. So I recommend you become a channel member. It is only 99 cents a month. You have instant communication with me almost. Your comments are replied to faster. Your suggestions are done faster. This is why I say active viewers. I don't just say any and everyone. I'm talking people who constantly watch me, okay? Like the OG people, right? I would love to stay in touch with the OGs, man. I don't want you guys to fade away. You know what I mean? So I purposely made it cheap, 99 cents. There's other perks that you also get, but I'm just going to link everything in the comments below the video where I explain all the perks that you get, man. Yeah, man. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.